Hello, thank you for coming to my talk. I'm going to be talking to you about manifesting ghosts of place through archaeology in ways that some people might have never thought about it. I'm not talking about ghosts in the paranormal sense, but instead I'm talking about what makes the seemingly dead places like this come alive. This is a building near where I live in New York's Hudson Valley, and about every other year there's a newspaper article about that this should be torn down, and about half the community wants it to stay because they're enamored with this ruin. So, why do we find places to be haunted or talk about them as if they're haunted, even if we have no proof that there's paranormal spirits there? I believe that places like these ruins connect to people because of the unanswered questions. People want to wonder about what happened here. They want to think about, why did this building not go away? They want to get a sense of, why does this place not fit with what I know? This house is in the Catskill Mountains in New York, and draw your attention to the fact that the roof is almost perfect, even though all the windows have been knocked out. There's no glass left, there's no front door, and yet there's nothing there, no gate to prevent you from going inside. I think people like ruins and haunted places because they want to think about how they themselves will avoid the same fate of being abandoned or dying in some way that is not considered natural. In short, I think places become haunted because people think that there are lessons to be learned from them. So the enchanting or the haunting is in the wondering. There are no paranormal entities needed for a place to haunt us. So when I talk about the ghosts in this presentation, I'm talking about the ghosts of place as defined by Michael Mayerfield Bell in his 1997 article, Theory and Society. These ghosts are the sense of those who are not physically there. There's some combination of memories, but also imaginations, fears, and longings, especially longing for a simpler time in the past. So the ghosts of place are very tightly connected to phenomenology of place, which we'll return to in a minute. First, I want to give you what I think is Bell's best definition of the ghost of place, or the best example of it in his article. This is a direct quote. He says, "Who has not experienced that flood of images of people long gone, or people when they were younger, while revisiting an old haunt, as we say? Who has not had that slightly chilly and yet very warm feeling of almost being able to see your friends from when you were 8 dashing down the sidewalk as you walk through the neighborhood where you grew up?" So Bell is not saying here, and this is what American audiences like to think about. They're not. He's not saying that your friends when you were 8 were murdered and their ghosts are there to haunt you. He's saying that you're haunted by the memory of being with your friends in that place, and that memory might be a conglomerate of memories, not an actual one time that happened. So the ghosts of place add to existing archaeological theory of memory and phenomenology of landscapes, which focuses on trying to get a handle on the experiences of people who inhabited archaeological sites. And ghosts of place extend this to include the experiences of people who interact with our sites. This is a picture from one of my class field trips of a student. She was actually Bigfoot hunting, but that's a whole separate presentation. So, using some common terminology here to link in the ghosts of place, social memory, as defined by Pearson and Shanks in their 2001 book, Theater Archaeology, which is one of my all time favorite archaeology books, they say time stands still in social memory. There are no clocks, no past as it was, no ordained chronology. There are instead enfoldings. So, what happened before and what happened now can touch each other, and this happens especially in places that are considered ruins. So, using Julia King's 2012 book, Archaeology Narrative and the Politics of the Past, she said that ruins are proxies for what has taken place on the landscape that allow visitors to bear witness. So, when you see a ruin, you're basically entering into this enfolding of social memory. And that's where we bring in Bell's ghosts. He says ghosts constitute the specificity of historical sites. These places, these historical sites, haunt the places of our lives. So, historical sites are especially haunted. This is a picture of a cemetery not far from where I live. And I want to draw your attention to the name of the place, Netherwood, which kind of means nothing but means everything at the same time in some sort of sense of nostalgia. And please excuse the fact that in the Hudson Valley of New York, 1789 is a long time ago. So, at places like this, the past is physically permeating into the present. These stones that are hundreds of years old are present in 2020 or 2021. And these places encourage viewers to recall some sort of past that might be totally manufactured. I don't know anything about Netherwood, but I can imagine what it was like based on that name and this place. So I have a question for you, which I'm going to try to say as a statement, but it's a question for you. That if archaeologists pay more attention to the ghosts of place, can we tell better stories of landscapes, sites, and artifacts? To incorporate the ghosts of place into archaeology, I think we need to understand what people are looking for when they consume ghost stories and ghost tourism, and especially when they go out on ghost hunts. All of these things do not require the paranormal to be entertaining, to be interesting. What we require is your ability to put the farmer back on this plow using your own mind and your thoughts and memories. So I did a study of ghost stories, ghost tourism, and ghost hunting, and I'm going to give you some of my findings from those. And I think it's really interesting if you consume a lot of ghost stories that you'll notice that they often include an archaeologist or an antiquarian, because a ghost story needs people who meddle with the past to bring the ghost to come to that haunting. So Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House established the American genre of the haunted house. And her main protagonist in that book is Dr. Montague, who is an archaeologist slash anthropologist. These stories usually center on explaining the lingering materiality, such as why do these houses from another time persist? So these ghost stories are almost always place or thing based, just like archaeology. Sometimes a person is haunted, and it's usually a young woman if it is, but oftentimes it's more of a demon story than a ghost story. And in general, ghost stories cause listeners to ask about what is real or important. Ghost tourism is site based storytelling, which focuses on group experiences. And these also center on explaining a lingering materiality, but the focus is more on local history rather than on any place in the world. So I want to draw your attention to the top image where the ghost tour of Ireland, haunted houses, hotels, and castles. If you take out the word ghost and haunted, you pretty much have an archaeology site tour. And the bottom image is an advertisement for the Ghost Bus, where they have a quote in the upper right hand corner that says, "It's pretty scary to know how quickly time flies." And I think you could read that two ways. One way is you don't really want to spend the afternoon with your family, but if you go on a ghost bus tour, time will fly by. Or you could read it as if you go to all these places from 100, 200, 300, 400 years ago, it allows you to think about the passage of time in a different way. So, again, these cause the listeners to ask what is real or important. But I think ghost tourism also allows people to think about what is going to last. What of my community will persist 100 or 200 years from now? So, ghost hunting is an interesting topic because there's a duality to ghost hunting, especially since a lot of ghost hunting is done, recorded in videos, put into TV shows and movies. So, using Michelle Hank's book, Haunted Heritage: The Cultural Politics of Ghost Tourism, Populism, and the Past, and my own ghost hunting, I've come to see that there's two different aspects. One is the ghost hunter, and one is the viewer of the ghost hunter. So the hunter themselves, or the paranormal investigator, is usually a middle class non believer who is looking for proof of the paranormal. So the paranormal is not necessary for you to be a paranormal investigator, because if you are one, you probably don't actually believe in ghosts. For viewers, they're actually partaking in ghost tourism. But according to Michelle Hanks in her ethnography of ghost tourists, she found that ghost tourists generally are people who are looking to connect with local histories that do not focus on governments, wars, soldiers, battles, kings, queens, and things like that. They want stories about people like them more than they want to actually experience any paranormal entity. So I see that ghost hunters and archaeologists are both trying to bridge the past and the present. I think their methodology is very similar, and I think there's only one key aspect that's different. Both ghost hunters and archaeologists find a site, they place it in historic context, they speak to owners and community members, and then they just do a slightly different methodology to gather their evidence. A ghost hunter will turn off the lights, where an archaeologist may or may not excavate the ground. Then both gather their evidence, and then the hunters will turn their lights back on, and the archaeologists may or may not backfill their units. But then they both interpret evidence and disseminate the results. So it's important here to make this distinction clear, that the ghosts of place are not the same as the ghosts that are trying to be detected by the paranormal investigators. As Bell says in his article, the ghosts of place are invisible to our current science. No laboratory instrument, no metered machine, no photographic negative will ever detect them, but we should have no doubt that they are still very real. So, how do you manifest the ghosts of place? You don't need some sort of candles or some symbols or something like that, although candles can help set the mood. What you need to do is to provide your audience with a sense of history of what happened here, and preferably told from the place where it happened. But that what you're providing them with should not be based on chronology. It should be a shared exploration where dates and events are brought up as necessary instead of just presented in mass. It's also important to leave some things unexplained. You have to make space for the suspense and wondering for people to feel connected like they do in a ghost story. There's also manifesting will be encouraged through the use of stories that speak to timeless human issues such as unexpected tragedy, unrequited love, and inescapable socioeconomic status. That makes the story about them because these are the things that they are experiencing and trying to make sense of. And again, the warnings of what might happen, these worst case scenarios and how to avoid the same fate, I think is the hook of a haunted place or a place that enchants us. So we need to think about how ghost hunters use historic sites and how they use them very successfully to capture the attention of their audience. There are very successful ghost hunting TV shows, even though almost every episode finds nothing. The Travel Channel's Ghost Adventures is into its 22nd season, and that does not include a bunch of spin offs. That primary show, Ghost Adventures, went to the Morris Jumel Mansion, which is billed themselves as Manhattan's oldest house. So this is a place in New York. And Zach Bagans, the head investigator, quote, "It is not a mansion. It is a time capsule full of precious objects that were connected to the people that lived 200 years ago." It's a very archaeological sensibility and an archaeological thing to say. That's not the only time that they use archaeology. They use archaeology in many of their episodes, and they go to museums in many of their episodes. But in one series of episodes, they actually did a landscape archaeology study if you take away a lot of the paranormal aspect. These three sites are in Kentucky in the United States: Rocky Point Manor, the H.P. Bottom House, and the Dye House. And they're all associated with the American Civil War. At Rocky Point Manor, they used metal detectors to dig up objects in the yard, including nails, and they spent time analyzing them. They crawled in the crawl spaces, pulled out animal bones and some meat food refuse, and they brought them to an archaeologist and asked the archaeologist to identify them. At the HP Bottom House, they looked at the useware of floors and stairs and talked about how different rooms were used differently. And they did an analysis of bullet holes in a wall to see where the gun would have been fired to make the hole. At the Dye House, they did electronic voice phenomenon recordings, and they believed that they were hearing names. And they went and searched the archives to come up with the names of the people that they believed were talking to them through the electronic voice phenomenon. In comparison, archaeologists use historic sites and possibly somewhat less successfully. The most successful archaeology show, I think we would mostly agree, is the BBC's Time Team America, which lasted for 20 seasons. But Time Team America only lasted for 2 seasons. So the Time Team that's not America, much more successful. And I could have populated this slide with lots of other archaeology themed shows, but I think most of them use archaeology as a brand and sacrifice the science or oversell the mystery in order to get viewers. So, why don't archaeologists use ghost hunting? And I will acknowledge that this is a hazardous cliff, but I think the fear of going too far may be holding us back from capturing some of the magic that the ghost hunters capture in getting audiences to care about sites. So, I've been exploring the edges for you, and I'm happy to fall off the cliff while you stay safe at home. So, some of the things that I've done during this exploration is I've attended ghost lectures, including a very cold February morning. On a Saturday, I drove over an hour away to Linda Zimmerman's Haunted Hudson Valley Talk, which was hosted by the local historical society and Friends of the Library in a town far from where I live. So I got there early and quite early, and the room was already full. So the room filled beyond its 135 person capacity on this cold Saturday morning. If I gave a Saturday morning talk, I don't think I would get 135 people. And when they introduced her, the organizer said this was twice the size of audience for any event that the Historical Society and the library had ever co hosted. I participated in ghost hunts and tours, including the last time an archaeology conference was in New Orleans. About 10 archaeologists, and we went together on this ghost tour. And one of the stops was supposed to be a haunted bar. And we were talking to the bartender who pulled out a box of artifacts from behind the counter. And we stood there analyzing them for probably way too long. I've also participated in a ghost hunt at the Hyde Park train station, which is adjacent to the home of Franklin Delano Roosevelt National Park site. And it was co hosted by the organization trying to keep this open as a museum, and a woman who was actually on the sci fi TV channel's ghost hunting show. But I've also gone ghost hunting with my students in the basement of the main building of Vassar College, where Matthew Vassar founded the college, and supposedly where he died while he was reading his retirement speech. Very, very bad timing for dying while you're reading your retirement speech. And I've compiled all the campus ghost stories that 200 hours of archival research could compile. And I have 2 walking ghost tours of the Vassar campus and a seated ghost stories of Main building. And during the Ghost Stories of Maine, I tell a Mark Twain story. He told the story, The Golden Arm, when he visited Vassar in 1885. And I try to tell it in the same room that Mark Twain told the story. And lastly, I've taught with ghost hunting in my classes, including as a graded assignment. This octagon building in the center was the focus of a course called The Power of Place, where we did architectural history, oral history, archaeological analysis, And we ghost hunted. And in the upper right, some students wanted to work with a Ouija board, and they did that in the Octagon house during a thunderstorm, which was lovely. There's always a thunderstorm when I'm ghost hunting, and I don't plan that out. And in the bottom right is a picture from one of our videos of our ghost hunt, where we inexplicably got locked out of this room, and you could see that the padlock is unlocked. Last semester, I taught ruins and haunting heritage, and because of COVID, I put all of my videos on YouTube for my lectures. And if you could see there, I only got 40 hits. So I did not go viral with my archaeology and ghost hunting exploration. So all of these things brought me to some understanding, some findings to share with you. And the main finding that I alluded to in the beginning is that the paranormal experience is unnecessary for people to feel that a hunt, a tour, or a story is a successful one. What people are looking for is experiential storytelling. They want to use places and things to create connections to themselves and each other. And they want to generate memorable experiences. My students thought that our ghost hunts were successful when they had interesting stories about the ghost hunt to tell other people. So, what is archaeology missing when it's not taking that little inching towards the cliff of ghost hunting? Well, they're missing these two ideas, I think, that were spoken of in the 1990s in some of the ghost literature, including an annual review of Anthropology article on spirit possession and a Journal of Folklore article on ghost stories and local tragedies. First, the paranormal is a playful space for reflection where the audience can fetishize the past while resisting an undesirable present. And second, that ghost stories allow us to rethink what is normal and help us understand ruptures in daily life. None of these challenge whether or not we're being a scientist, and none of these are encouraging us to lie or mislead. I never have people dress up in costumes and jump out at people during our ghost tours or anything like that, because you don't need to, because the stories and the experience is what people want. So I'm going to give you a very brief overview of how I think this can help enhance archaeology with the ghosts of a county poorhouse. So I recently published about this poorhouse and its cemetery in the International Journal of Historical Archaeology. And the picture, the black and white picture, is of the poorhouse building on the right, and also the lunatic asylum building on the left. And today, the only building that still stands is the building on the right, the original poorhouse building, which is the color picture. And it is falling down, what we call around here is demolition by neglect. But in the woods behind that poorhouse and former lunatic asylum is their cemetery. And the last burial was made there in 1955 when William Patterson died, and he was placed in grave 748. In just 50 years, the cemetery became a forest. And if you can't see a cemetery in that picture, don't worry, the students who are there trying to protect and restore the cemetery can't find the graves either. The markers that remain are extremely small. They're about this big in diameter. Those are blades of grass that look like big, huge leaves of trees. And most of them are broken. Some of them are partially buried. Some of them are unreadable. So these markers that remain are the thing that can connect us to that haunting history of this poorhouse and its cemetery. There's only one headstone of what we would consider a traditional headstone in the entire cemetery, which has about 1,000 bodies in it. This is the headstone of Lewis Hubble, who was orphaned at the age of 10. And he worked most of his life as a laborer. And by the time he was 59 years old, he was ill and poor and wound up in the poorhouse. He died within a year of his admittance. And the only relative that he ever had remaining when he died was a sister who lived in California. And when she found out that her brother died in New York and was buried with just one of those numbered markers, she went through the trouble of having a gravestone installed that the top says, "My brother, Lewis B. Hubble." So this is a great example of how there's this connection between people and places that transcends that everybody else is just this kind of anonymous number, but the love of a brother and a sister caused this one person to have a tombstone. One person who is in this cemetery, but we do not know where, is a man named Robert Schofield. He was a Civil War soldier for the American Civil War. He was in Company I of the 26 New York Colored Volunteers. Theoretically, he is one of the people in this picture. There's no amount of zooming that will ever be able to identify it, and we don't know what he looks like to get us to there, even if we could see. He was admitted to the poorhouse in 1894 while his friends were trying to get him veterans benefits for being in the Civil War, and he was being denied as a colored soldier. He died only 18 days after entering the poorhouse of kidney disease, and the records did not record what number his grave was. Although this was the poorhouse and lunatic asylum, lots of people wound up in this cemetery as a pauper cemetery that were never in the poorhouse. This includes babies and people found dead in the river and dead along the railroad tracks. This newspaper article from 1941 announces the death of Patricia Jones, who was a 6-month-old child who was found dead in her crib. She is buried in grave 680. Also buried there is John Walker, who was 44 years old when he was found drowned in a shallow creek in 1950. An alcohol bottle was found in his pocket. He's in grave 730. We used a lot of archaeological techniques to re-find some of the dead. Using remote sensing, we were able to identify 568 unmarked graves. Those are the smallest dots on this map. Through surface survey, we were able to document 233 grave markers. And there's a variety of their typologies there. Some are enameled on the top, some are not. Some have 2 numbers, some have 1. Some are twice as big than the others. And using traditional archaeological techniques, we were able to look for patterns in how people were buried. And what we found is that the people of the Dutchess County Poorhouse and Pauper Cemetery are not organized by race, ethnicity, or religion. They were buried as one community of dead with the simple pattern of somebody would be buried on the east side of the cemetery, and then the next person on the west side, and then the next person back on the east. There's an air of practicality here, not an air of prejudice. So the archaeology at the Poorhouse Cemetery can help us to counter the decay. Even though there are some of these markers still left, these round markers are popping up out of the ground with various freeze and thaw cycles. And because they're round, they literally roll down the hill and don't stay anywhere near where they originally were. This is a map that we made with the archaeological data in GIS, and it is now a huge map on an interpretive kiosk at the site where we've identified the locations of the Hubble gravestone, some of the babies, and the last burial to help people orient and help people to be able to imagine all of the people that are under the ground, even where the markers are no longer there. So is this Poorhouse Cemetery a haunted place? This picture is not of New York. This is the obligatory picture of Orkney for all the people who presented before me and had their Orkney pictures. This is a cemetery in Stromness, Orkney. But I think it represents the kind of idea that most people have about what their burial place will be like. A beautiful setting sun near the ocean and big, huge markers that persist for hundreds of years. But at this Dutchess County Poorhouse Cemetery, we could see how people that were supposed to be cared for by the county were forgotten and allowed to disappear. And that allows us to think of what will become of us when we die. What should linger and what should decay? So to close up, historical archaeology as ghost hunting, I believe, has a couple of organizing principles. that all it requires instead of actual ghosts is that we see our sites as ruptures in normal time. And that as experts, we spend the time to gather evidence to tell their stories, whatever that evidence looks like. And to impact the listener, which would be a goal of this sort of historical archaeology, we focus on the stories that are relevant to whoever is listening to us at that time. So I might tell somebody else a very different story about that poorhouse cemetery because of what is relevant to them. When the goal of all of this is to leave visitors connected to the past and hopefully to have a story that they want to tell other people. So if you're interested in more of what I was thinking about with ghosts and or this poorhouse cemetery, I've been publishing this in books called Lost City Found Pyramid and Blurring Timescapes, Subverting Erasure, Remembering Ghosts on the Margin of History. And the article on the cemetery is in the International Journal of Historical Archaeology, and it came out this summer. Thank you.